myths about griffins. I always thought they were totally legendary, but they're true. Because it looks very much like it's the skull of a griffin.
Yeah.
A comment and a question. I stumbled across this book about a archaeological chemist, I'm not sure the exact term, but he would use the same kind of chemical processes you use to determine where the old purple dyes would go, to track traces of wine. And it was a really fascinating book, but it shows you how all these different disciplines within were kind of connected. You're talking about dye, then you're talking about wine, then you're talking about trade, then you're talking about were these things invented independently in different areas, or did it travel? So I love that kind of thing. And the question has nothing to do with that. In secondary world fantasy, you can take a culture and you can say, I want to do this, but I wanted to very deliberately change this one aspect. And it can be an intention of the world, but how do you convey to your reader that I did this on purpose? It's not because I'm dumb.
Oh, well, yeah, okay. That's the, I think of that as the plywood shield rule.
Yes, yes.
I learned from him. Early in my writing career, David told me how he used to, in novels, he would refer to Roman shield as being plywood. And he would get bombarded with letters from people saying this is completely anachronistic.
I had a guy phone me from San Francisco. I'm in North Carolina. How could you make such a stupid mistake?
And David, being somewhat a stubborn person, kept doing it until finally Jim Bain explained to him, look, if enough of your readers think you're wrong, you've got a problem whether you are or not. So when he told me this story, in the next Belisarius book I wrote, I put in plywood shields, and they happened to show the manuscript to a friend of mine, and he immediately complained about the anachronism. And I told him what was funny about it. And what I did, though, is I changed it to laminated wood shields, and everybody is happy.
Seriously, you've got you've got a layer of beechwood, then a cross layer of beechwood, and a third layer of beechwood that's cross the middle layer. So, you know, you've got 3 plies of beechwood laminated together with glue and heat.
Which is plywood.
And that's what archaeologists call it. However,
to go back to your point you bring up, one of the things you actually have to learn to do, if you put an historical fact into a novel that you think a lot of readers are going to think you goofed, you've got to figure out some way in the text of making clear, no, I know what I'm talking about,
you dummy.
Jimmy, so just shut up and keep reading. And you've got to figure out ways to do
It seems like it's always the things that you're making up and you're working really hard on, and everybody's fine with that. And you just throw in your historical or archaeological thing, and that's what everybody says, oh no.
Yeah.
I think that would also be a place to think about when you want the readers to know that it's based on a real world culture, and when you want them to think that you've done a lot of work making it up. Because I think if you have something that's recognizably a real world culture, even if you rename some names, and then you change one thing, that's when people are going to get really upset. But if you do sort of a little bit more work to say, combine 2 different cultures, or take it away in a different direction enough where it's not clearly just a real world culture, that's when I think you can be a little bit more successful in sort of tweaking elements. And I think that it's an interesting choice that you have to make whether you want readers to recognize a real world culture or not. And what you definitely don't want to do is sort of think that you've hidden it and that people recognize it. So it might be better to like just go for it.
There's an old joke that world building is a good occupational therapy for lunatics who think they're God. You know, so you can't not take stuff from real world stuff because no one can make up an entire culture. It just can't be done. Yeah.
I'd like to think a little bit. One of the 2 of you made comment of legends having value in archaeological work, and that really fascinates me. And I'm wondering how often legend or mythology, which comes obviously right at the beginning of recorded history, just a bit before recorded history, where people were kind of making note of things but not writing it down. How often does that kind of material really help?
Tremendously. I'm working on something now that is a retelling of the Trojan War, but not from a Homeric point of view, but from the Trojans' point of view. And another thing that I've been looking at is Virgil's Aeneid, which we were talking about this earlier in terms of why are things written. Well, that was written in essence for the benefit of the Roman aristocracy to say, look, see, you're basically traced back to the heroes from ancient Troy.
Yeah.
It was nonsense, but
It wasn't nonsense. He died very wealthy.
true.
Augustus was happy with him.
That's true.
Now, what Ovid did, that was nonsense.
If you don't mind ending up staring at the Black Sea.
Yeah, you know, learning
I'll say,
Scythian.
Two things. One is I've seen some interesting stuff sort of starting up with looking at sort of legends in terms of looking at migration and population movement and that sort of thing, because it seems like they do change over time, but there is a certain sense of fidelity, so it's almost linguistic in looking at where a particular type of myth occurs around the world and then saying, might there have been a common ancestor myth of that sort of thing. And then the other thing is, from a sort of North American pre-contact archaeological sort of perspective, I will say that it's tough to go on oral traditions alone, but I've seen really, really cool stuff done with them sort of in conjunction with archaeological evidence. I have noted down, they found recently in Alaska Asian forged metal from 700 years ago, which is before the European recorded first sort of contact in that area. But it sort of matches up a little bit with the sort of local oral tradition about people coming in by sea for trade and that sort of thing. So it would be, I think, a tough sell to say, obviously there was extensive trade with Asians because here it is in the oral tradition, but then combined with the metal found in sites, you have really cool conclusions.
What pleases me particularly about that is the notion of story informing history.
Yeah. You've got to be selective about oral traditions too. Like taking the Homeric stuff. There's a lot of Bronze Age stuff in Homer. Homer was the poems probably compiled about 8th century BC.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's the best bet.
But there's a lot of
Possibly even later.
Yeah.
You know.
But there's a lot of Bronze Age stuff that was hundreds and hundreds of years old when the poems were compiled. Things like forms of equipment.
The boar tusk helmets, which were absolutely real, but not at the time the poems were.
Yeah.
In fact, there's a wonderful example of one if anybody gets to the Washington, D.C. area in the National Geographic Museum. They have one of the boar tusk ones that's exhibited.
Just saw it at Mycenae this summer.
But Homer was writing not writing, he was composing in an illiterate society. And it was not only illiterate, but they'd lost, in the post-Mycenaean collapse, they'd lost even the concept of writing. If I remember correctly, there's a plot point in Homer where someone is carrying a message and it says, "Please execute bearer." And you can't take the plot point out because it's important. So he says there are baleful signs written on the message, which will make the recipient kill the bearer. But he can't actually say, he wrote "Please execute bearer" because they'd forgotten about writing and hadn't reacquired it from a different source, by the way. So, like there's stuff that actually dates back to the Mycenaean period. There's stuff that dates back further because there were poetic kennings in Homer that are actually common with the Rig Veda. So they probably go back to Proto-Indo-European stuff. Ishiran Manas and the Hiron Menos, holy and powerful. It's a poetic epithet. It's a stock kenning that's used. And it's common to Vedic, Sanskrit, and Homeric Greek. But other things had just like completely vanished and were outside his mental horizon, like writing and bureaucracy. So, you got to be selective.
We need to close down. It is now 2 o'clock. And people are gathered, they're starting the infiltration. You can see the